Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. It is such a joy to be with you today, and it is a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Amal Ahmadi from our Hindley, UK campus. Amal is a postdoctoral fellow in organizational behavior. She is originally from Bahrain, so we are truly keeping it global for you here at Henley. Today is a little bit different. We're changing pace a little bit. The last 3 days has been nothing but intense. You've learned a great deal. We started with thinking through how to build a digital business as a non-techie. We looked at sales from a digital perspective. Yesterday, there was a lot of information on how to really market well from a digital point of view. And today we take a look at the jockey, the person that has to make all of that happen. And we think about how to close the knowing and the doing gap. There is a quote that I like particularly by Ursula Le Guin, and she says, "The worst walls are never the ones you find in your way. The worst walls are the ones that you put there." And let's face it, you've been through a lot these past weeks and months. It hasn't been easy. And now we're encouraging you to wade into brand new waters. So today we have the right person with us to help us think through that. Before I hand you over into Amal's super capable hands, I want to let you know that you can visit our microsite at sme.henleyonline.co.za, where you will find, if you go into the content link with the different sessions, you'll be able to click through to our website, where you'll be able to access the videos for the first 3 days, as well as the presentations. We are presently still working on getting the presentations as well as the videos for subsequent sessions to you. We are getting there, bear with us, but soon you'll be able to access those as well. And then, of course, as always, as you find things helpful, please share. Caring is sharing, sharing is caring, and use our hashtag SME sessions as you do so. So with that, Amal, can I ask you to bring up your video, bring up your voice, so that we can introduce you to this wonderful community of ours.
Hello, hello.
Amal, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you with us. Amal, can I hand over to you, and will you tell us more about how we close this knowing-doing gap that we find ourselves in?
Sure. Thank you, Louise. Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. I hope everybody's having a good day. Let me put up my slides, and we shall take it from there. Okay. So today we will be talking about closing the knowing-doing gap, as Louise has explained. Now, over the past few days and maybe over a week now, you have been learning all these lessons about how to stabilize, how to assess, and now we're moving into pivot and grow. So all of these lessons that you have learned, you might have compiled so many ideas about the way forward. What would you like to change, alter, reboot, improve? What would you like to keep doing the same way? And so how do we now close the knowing-doing gap and make sure that all of these ideas and good plans and good intentions are actually put into place and turned into real action? So this is what we will be talking about today. We will be taking the theme of looking at productivity, being that our productivity might have changed in the current tough times. We'll be exploring a little bit about that. But the key from today's session is just an opportunity for you to have time to reflect on your own self-leadership. So we're looking deep into ourselves and how we can lead ourselves in this session, as opposed to leading the business or SME or a wider scale leading others. So it's more looking inwards, but feel free to pose any questions on any level. So you might want to ask about the knowing-doing gap in any other context that is relevant to you, that applies to you, and let's take it from there. So basically, I start this with this slide because I just want to say that survival and digital transformation in these tough times really starts with us as individuals. We might be thinking of large scale, big ideas, but really, how do we get to these big ideas? It always starts with the individual, and an individual gets to others and then gets to others, and that's how ideas grow. And so that's why we really want to take a step to reflect inwards today. And I want to look at this in terms of your own self-leadership. So how do you lead yourself in this time? The current difficult circumstances have changed the way that we work, have changed the place that we work for many of us. How are you leading yourself in this tough time? Nobody wants to be led by someone that can't lead themselves, right? I know this applies to me, but it's all about leading by example. And how can we be better leaders in our own lives in order to be better leaders of other people, of our businesses, of other contexts? So that's what we will be looking at today in more detail. So in terms of the agenda, and this agenda is fluid, so we could move around, we could switch things up. I will be posing a lot of slides with breaks for you to ask any questions, so we don't have to necessarily stick to this, but this is a plan for where we're going today. We'll be starting by talking about the knowing-doing gap. I'll explain a bit more about what the knowing-doing gap is and our interest in looking at that and why is it so important. And then we'll do some exercises for you to reflect on your own experience about how the knowing-doing gap might be applicable to you. Is it relevant in your own context? Is it something you can relate to in the current times? What does it look like and how does it manifest in your own experiences? So we'll be looking at that with a couple of exercises, and then we'll be exploring some potential drivers of why this might happen. So why is it that much of what we know and what we learn doesn't always translate into real action? There are various reasons, and we will be exploring some of those and exploring what might apply in your context. But then we will focus the second part of today's session on looking at fear. And that is one driver that I'm particularly interested in, and that I think is really relevant to all of us in the current times. We're all faced with uncertainty, with lots of change, and there are fears that can't stand in our way of acting upon our knowledge. So we'll be looking at fear, and I know this is something that was covered by Mark in an earlier session, where he spoke about fear and anxiety in the face of uncertainty. So we'll be just taking that another step further to think about strategies for how we can overcome fear in the current circumstances to close our knowing-doing gaps, if we have any. And then lastly, in today's session, we'll be looking at productivity in what we now call the new normal. So how has our productivity changed? Has it even changed? And how can we increase or sustain our productivity going forward? So feel free to ask any questions at any point. What you will need today, and you might have a coffee and a cake, you might not, but feel free to sit back, relax, grab a drink, and take this as an opportunity to really just think about your own experiences, your own self-leadership, and let's not worry about solutions for now. Let's think about where we're at and just reflect on our current states before we get to the solutions. We'll do that in the second session, the second part of today's session, I mean. But for the start, if you have a tablet, a phone, and notepad, anything on you where you can jot notes down, that might be really helpful when we do the exercises, so you can note things down. If you have any reflections, you might want to keep a diary of these and then revisit after COVID's over, hopefully whenever that happens, and see how things might have changed then. So let's get started with the knowing-doing gap. Before I get to that, do we have any comments, questions, anything about the agenda for today? If you have any suggestions on what might apply to you, what topics you would like covered, please go ahead and ask any questions. So in terms of the knowing-doing gap, just to provide you with some background, I have been interested in this topic for a number of years now, and I've pursued this as a topic for my PhD research a while back. And I was always interested by the knowing-doing gap because I felt that it was something that we all face and has a universal application in whatever context you think of in life. We know a lot of things that we want to do and we don't necessarily achieve those, or we don't put our knowing into doing at all times. So I looked at this in terms of leadership, and I think this can be applicable to many of you as leading SMEs. And I looked at the problem of why organizations are spending so much money to develop their managers into better leaders, But then our interest in leadership development is always looking at leadership development as an end in itself, as opposed to looking at how then our leadership learning translates back in our organizations, in our context, in our SMEs, in our lives even. How do we take that learning, that knowing that we store up here and really do something about it and make it happen? So what I found is that in research and in many organizations, the spending on leadership development is the end in itself, but there is not enough follow-up done to look at how then this spending translates into better leadership, into different kinds of leadership back in the organization. And this really got me thinking about how this applies in our day-to-day lives. It has a universal application, whether you're thinking about this professionally or personally. Even if you think personally, I know I need to be eating better, I need to be cooking things from scratch, I need to be sleeping more. People who are looking for relationships, looking to form bonds with other people, they know they need to have that difficult conversation, but they don't always do it. Why are we often held back? And why does our knowing not always translate into actual doing? So that's essentially what got me interested. And I just wanted to give you some background as to why we are talking about this today. I think this is even more important in the current times now. We're faced with so much change and uncertainty, and we have these ideas about how we might want to go forward, maybe reboot, change, alter, and trying to get to grips with the new normal and trying to envision what the world would look like after we get out of this new normal back into the old normal, or the newer new normal, or what are we going to even call that? So how do we get what we're thinking about into real action, and how do we start doing that now? And research has found that much of our knowledge is actually conceptual and procedural knowledge and doesn't necessarily apply and become applied knowledge. What I mean by that, to give you an example on leadership, when it comes to conceptual knowledge, a lot of managers know what leadership is conceptually. So we might have a definition of what leadership might look like in our heads. We might have procedural knowledge of leadership. So we know what leadership actually needs to look like in certain situations. We know exactly when and how to enact leadership, but that doesn't necessarily always translate into applied knowledge when leadership is actually required. And you see that in many examples of leaders across the world, and there's a lot of talk, not a lot of action in a lot of situations. And so we tend to talk about things or make plans, write things down, but making a plan, writing something down, talking about it, holding meetings about it, isn't actually doing it, right? And that's what I'm really interested in covering today. So how can we get our knowing, whatever your knowledge might be? We will be looking at this in the context of productivity and leadership, as I've already given an example, but this applies to anything. So think about this in your own experience. How does your knowing, in whatever context that you're thinking of, can be translated into doing? And the gap exists when your knowing isn't fully translated. Now, the reason I have these gray arrows here, the widening and the closing on this slide, is because in some situations, we might have a wider gap between our knowing and our doing. And in another similar situation, we might be enacting more of our knowledge, and so our gap closes. And so the arrows really reflect a dynamic, because it's not to say that we're always not acting upon our knowledge or always not doing things. We might not have a gap in certain situations. You might have these two boxes actually collide. But I'm really interested in looking at situations in which there is a gap, and what can we do to bridge or close that gap? How can we cross the bridge from ambition to actual doing? So this will only really be relevant to you once you start thinking about it in your own context. So I'm going to pose a question to get us started looking at productivity in our current tough times during the COVID situation. So let's think about productivity. If you were to think about 3 key actions that you need to take in order to increase or sustain your productivity in the current times, what would they be? So I'll give you some time to think about 3 key actions that you believe are important for your productivity. If you feel that productivity isn't what you want to cover and you've already started thinking about the knowing doing gap in other contexts in your life, in your business, at work, professionally, personally, feel free to write 3 actions that are relevant to that. But we're taking productivity as an example just so that we're all on the same page. So let's take a few minutes to think about 3 key actions that you think are important to increase or sustain your productivity in the current times. And during that time, this is why you need the pad or somewhere to jot down your answers, because it will be helpful for the next question that we will do. And I will ask Louise if you could kindly play us some music or something to get our mood going, to get us thinking and reflecting, please. Thank you. If you have any questions about this, if anything is unclear, please post that in the Q&A function. I see a comment there, my mind is blank. I hope the music helps you. We need some time to think about that. Here we go. Okay, let's take another minute. I see a question about whether this needs to be long-term or looking at what you need to do immediately. I think that looking at what you need to do immediately might be more helpful at this point. But if you have a long-term plan, then feel free to reflect on that as well. If you are thinking of a long-term plan or an idea or an action, how can you break this down into something more immediate? What would you do now? What do you need to do now to get there? Thanks for those of you who are sharing in the Q&A. Okay. For those of you who are there, who have your 3 actions, would you like to share some in the Q&A, as others might need some more time? Okay, see, there's a bit of silence in the Q&A for now, but what we will do is move on to the next question, and then I will be covering what you're reflecting on in more detail, because the next question is the key one, really. So now you've noted down 3 actions that you think are important to increase or sustain your productivity, or any other context. The second question, which will really help us identify whether you have a knowing doing gap, will be to rate the extent to which you agree or disagree that you are engaging in each of these 3 actions right now. So this goes back to the earlier question of, are we thinking about this in the long term or more immediately? I'm encouraging you to think about the current day-to-day, what are you doing right now, and rate the extent to which you agree or disagree that you are engaging in these actions. So you have from strongly agree to agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And if you like, the next slide is actually helpful because it can show you if you jot down 3 actions here, I hope you can see my cursor as I'm moving on the slides. So you'll have 1, 2, and 3, and then you would rate. Forget the first column about I know this. I will skip this for now. I will get back to it and explain why it's there. We are now looking at I do this. So rate the extent to which you agree or disagree that you actually do this action right now or trying to engage in it in some way, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So let's take a couple of minutes to do that. And cue the music, Louise, if you can.
So I'm doing just that.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take another minute and then we'll get back. It is interesting for me to scroll down and see what you're reflecting on. Thank you all for sharing. One person's asking, Nelisa, how often should we be doing this exercise? Weekly, monthly? It depends on what you're trying to reflect on. If this is a more immediate, we'll be talking about how to prioritize tasks later on in the session. But if this is an immediate thing that you need to be doing right now, then maybe reflect on it more often. So a weekly basis, even a daily basis. If it's something like, I know somebody mentioned something around sleeping better, sleeping more. So you might want to reflect on this on a daily basis. So it depends on the context in which you're reflecting and what might apply to you. Okay, so going back to the knowing doing gap exercise, why have I asked you these 2 questions? If I show you an example. So the reason I have blurred the knowing column, I know this, is because you have selected these 3 actions and therefore the assumption is you know that these are important. If I were to apply this exercise and give you my own statements and rate whether you actually know that they are important, I would ask you to rate the knowing. I'm still keeping this in because it would show us the gap between knowing and doing. So I've asked you to rate your doing. I do this. And what it might look like, it's something like this on the next slide. This is an example for leadership. And I'm taking leadership as an example because I know that many of you are leading SMEs or leading other teams. So you might be able to reflect on this in your own context. So if I were to ask you to give me 3 leadership behaviors that you think are important for effective leadership in organizations, and say you've given me these 3 statements. You believe that effective leadership is to set a vision and a shared purpose, to empower others, and then to be authentic as a leader, right? Now, you would probably rate this as either strongly agree or agree because you came up with these statements. How do we find out where the gap is? The gap is where you actually rated your doing lower than neutral, or neutral and low. So if you look at to set a vision and shared purpose, you would strongly agree that this is important. And if you strongly agree that you do this, then there is no gap. You know that it's important as a leader to set a vision and a shared purpose for your team, for the people that are working with you, and you do this all the time. So there is no gap there. Now, with looking at the second point, to empower others, if you agree that empowering others is really important for effective leadership, but actually you're neutral about this. Say, for example, as a leader, maybe I am in some situations really empowering others to right along our shared purpose and do things and get actions done. In other situations, maybe I am overimposing, maybe I'm more of a director leader, a command and control type leader. So I'm not really empowering others to come out of their shell and participate or get involved. And so in that sense, I might think of myself as being neutral here when it comes to doing. In some situations I am doing it, in other situations I'm not. So there's a bit of a gap there between the knowing and the doing. Now, if we look at the final example, to be authentic as a leader, if I strongly agree that I need to be an authentic leader, but I actually disagree that I am authentic. So maybe in some situations, I try to be authentic, but in most situations I am not. I am putting on a face, I'm putting a mask, and I'm trying to be someone I'm not as a leader, because I think that that's the way I need to be portrayed, but it's not essentially how I am authentically. Then if I disagree, you can see that there's a wider gap pointed by the red arrow there, the red dashed lines. There's a wider gap between knowing and doing. And that's what I meant earlier about the dynamics, the arrows between knowing and doing. In some situations, you don't have a gap. In other situations, you might do. Within the same action, for example, to empower others, in some situations, you don't have a gap. In other situations, you might have a very wide gap. And so I hope that this exercise has given you a starting point to think about your own productivity, what you might want to do, and if you're actually doing those things. Has anyone found a lot of disagrees or strongly disagrees, big gaps? Maybe let's take some comments and questions here before we move on. Let's reflect on this exercise. What are your thoughts? What did you notice?
Amal, there's such an interesting question here. I wonder if I might pose it while you're
Sure.
waiting for questions for people to answer that question. John says it is hard to decide what productivity is in the current situation. As business people, we usually understand productivity to mean output, making money, etc. And that is just not happening at the moment, right?
Yeah, indeed, indeed. So think about it as your own productivity, your own outputs. If you were to achieve A, B, and C today, even if it's something like responding to an email, what might this be? Because yes, productivity is very different right now. And we will talk about this in the last section of today. But we're really not thinking about this in monetary terms now because we know that it's hard to hit that. So I'm really trying to think about this from your own self-leadership perspective. So how are you managing your own productivity? And you define your productivity however applies to you. It could be for some people that their productivity is a unit of sales. Say if you're in sales function and that's what you're used to, your productivity is measured by that number. And if you're not able to get that number, you're unproductive. I see what you mean. But try to think about it in a context that applies to you right now.
So in unusual times, we might have to create new definitions for ourselves to work by.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other interesting questions, Louise? Have you found anything?
Myrna Braun says, what about delusional leaders who think that they are empowering and rate themselves highly? Would this not be a negative exercise for them because it would reinforce bad leadership? Have you come across that?
I am very glad you've asked that question. This is an actually much more useful exercise if you do it with other people that work with you. Say if you are in a team, you do a sort of 360. So you rate your own self, but you actually won't know about this until someone else gives you feedback. You're absolutely right. And if you're not being completely honest with yourself as well, you might want to just use these boxes to reinforce or reassure yourself. But you really need to be open and honest here and think about this. And but if you're delusional, as you're noting in your question, then yeah, the best way of getting real answers is to get someone else to rate you and rate your doing. And that's a useful exercise to do in any other context within teams. Just think about any task, any actions that you need to achieve, and rotate and compare answers and see what matches and doesn't match. It could be a useful starting point to get those difficult conversations going.
And perhaps particularly in this time, because this is an unusual time. So how do we lend structure to a business unusual by using a tool such as this one, where we have to create our own definitions, perhaps in a contextual and collaborative way? Such an interesting approach, Amal. I love it.
Yeah, I like to do it on a personal level, just thinking about my own definitions, but I've also used it with other colleagues at some points in different contexts. And I find that it's more helpful when we arrive at a definition between us. If you're not working in isolation and you're working with others, then arrive at a shared definition before you start to do this exercise, if that makes sense.
I think that makes a great deal of sense. Thank you. Nadine, a comment from Nadine, and then I'm handing back over to you. She says, I knew that there was a gap between my do and my know. Finding time has always been an issue. Wearing so many hats in the business, I have to be productive in a million different ways. And the business comes first and my life comes second. Now, it is to think on how to improve and how to change my past behavior so that I can be more productive in the future. And there are a few people that says, well, now that I can see this, I can work on it, right?
Yeah.
So very
That
nice.
was essentially the aim from today's session, is not to give you the answer, but is to raise that awareness that we might have a knowing doing gap, and we might need to redefine things and redefine how we do things. So redefine what we know, but also redefine how we do. Because there are a lot of changes facing us now, and this whole COVID situation has challenged our way of living, our way of working, our way of seeing things, and our priorities. And so you try and arrive at a definition of how you define your knowing and how you define your doing and what works for you. And we'll get back to this really interesting question later on when we talk about productivity and how that's different in the current situation. Thank you all for sharing really interesting comments. I'm seeing others on the Q&A as well, and we can come back to some of those later.
Brilliant, Amal, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so this is another exercise which I'm calling a takeaway exercise. So something you might want to reflect on in your own time later on. Now you have your list. What do you do with the list? So try and think about it on a more deeper level, about thinking about why is it happening? If there is a gap, for example, between your knowing and your doing for one of the actions, what factors are actually standing in the way of your doing? If you're looking at this from a productivity context, so what is actually standing in the way of your productivity? Could this be an individual factor? Is it something to do with yourself? Is it maybe a contextual factor? Is it to do with our current circumstances? Also, you might want to think about the other side of it. So what factors might help you? What might enable the transfer from your knowing to your doing? And again, you might want to think about this from your own individual self-leadership, but also from a contextual level. What might be helpful in your context to really get you doing more? So I'll leave this as an exploration for you to do later in your own time as a takeaway from today's session. But if you would like to revisit it or ask any questions about that, please feel free. And this is just to give you an example from some of the factors that I found from the research that I conducted. So I did some interviews with leaders across the United Kingdom in different organizational contexts and different organizations and industries. And I just wanted to find out some of the individual and contextual factors that they thought stood in the way of their knowing and their doing. I also explored some of the literature out there. And these are just some examples that might get you thinking, but I don't want to go into them into great detail because I don't want to influence what you might want to come up with when answering your questions. But just to give you in a nutshell, some of the individual factors, well, a lot of people said things around, I know it needs to be done, but I simply don't have the motivation to do it. I'm a procrastinator. Some had issues around confidence, self-efficacy, and knowledge gaps. So actually, I know that I need to do something, but I don't know much about how to do it. And this is very relevant in today's time. So we need to be doing a lot of things digitally now and to do things online. And hopefully the previous sessions on these SME sessions, brilliant content that you've already explored and you will be exploring, gives you some tools and some tips and sources to increase that knowledge and close any knowledge gaps you might have. But then how do you get that new knowledge into real doing as well? A lot of people talked about self-efficacy and not having the confidence to try something new, fear of making mistakes, fear of failure, which we will cover later on, and just individual priorities, just not wanting to prioritize that action. So if you think that an action is important and it is on your list, reflect a bit more about why that made it on your list. If it's a priority, then it needs doing. If it's not a priority, then why is it on your list? So that's another reflection to think about. As for contextual factors, many people spoke about things like hierarchy, bureaucracy standing in the way. Well, I need to get something done and I know how to do it, but there are so many levels up that I can't really get it done. It's not up to me, it's not my call. There are things about relationships, communication, feedback. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about getting your colleagues and other people that work with you or that live with you to do the same exercise. So you might see things differently. So you might think that something needs doing, but someone else thinks that it's not actually on their priority. So organizational priorities are also important here because they can go against individual priorities. So that's just some food for thought that I wanted to throw out there to get you thinking about your own context and think about why it is you might have a knowing-doing gap. Before we move on to fear, I wanted to look at fear and how it might stand in the way of knowing and closing our knowing-doing gaps. Do we have any questions?
All right, let's have a look. So we've got some comments here. Amal, Renate says, my number one is to manage and get rid of distractions so that I can get to the doing. However, with homeschooling and wearing multiple hats, it's harder than I anticipated. This creates a wider gap. And I think this goes back to the fact that we find ourselves in a new normal, right?
Yes.
So what does productivity look like in a new normal and in a new context? And especially in a situation where we're responsible for many other people's productivity in ways that we weren't previously.
Yeah. We will cover this in more detail later on, but I feel you. Productivity does look different, especially if you have kids at home and you're not used to working around others as well.
Absolutely. Some appreciation for the session today. Says that people feel that it speaks to what they're grappling with right now. So I think I'm going to hand right back over to you. Thanks,
Great.
Amal.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you all for sharing. So let's look at fear and the knowing-doing gap. These are some common fears. I don't know what scares you, but think about that. What is scaring you? And right at the center there, this what looks like a beautiful red ball isn't actually beautiful. And it's been scary for all of us in all our different contexts. This is a common fear right now on a global scale, I think. And I just wanted to look at how fear can stand in the way of us acting upon our knowledge, not necessarily the fear of corona, but fear of other things, such as the ones on this slide. Basically, this is a summary of some of the common fears that I found when speaking with leaders about what stands in their way of translating their knowing into doing. And a lot of it is related and can be reflected upon in light of COVID. But look at this, for example, fear of change, fear of uncertainty. This is something we are all currently facing in the current tough times. There's a lot of change, there is a lot of uncertainty. And in light of uncertainty, and when we feel that things are out of control, we are more likely to be fearful. To give you a bit more background on this, actually, from a psychology perspective, fear arises when we evaluate situations as fearful. So it's not necessarily out there, but it's how we interpret our situations, how we appraise our current context that can raise fear in us. So from a psychological perspective, a person will experience fear in two cases. So when we're in a situation where there is a threat to our goal or to our well-being, and in a situation when it's out of our control. So there's a lot of uncertainty that we cannot control. So if you're in a situation that is threatening, but you can control it, you're less likely to be fearful. In a situation that is really uncertain, but is actually not really threatening you, again, you're not very likely to be fearful. But when these two collide in a situation that is really threatening and is out of your control, we're likely to experience fear. And I can't think of a better example than COVID for us to think about that. All of the uncertainties that surround our businesses, our personal, our professional lives, they can be threatening and they're totally out of our control. We don't know what the future will look like. When are we coming out of this lockdown? When are we going back to someone called it the abnormal normal. So what might happen afterwards? We just don't know. There are more questions than there are answers. And so that can raise a lot of fear. A very common fear that I found as well is the fear of failure and fear of making mistakes, which I see many of you have commented as well about that. So in the face of failure or just not knowing what to do and whether you're taking the right course of action, you're likely to experience fear. Other situations that were fearful for leaders were around other people. So the fear of confrontation and the fear of upsetting others. Many of you might have been in situations where you had to let people go, unfortunately. So how was that? Or maybe trying to speak up, to challenge the status quo and to change things up. If you feel that you really need to reboot and change at the moment, and you're going against the tune of what others are trying to achieve, how is that really affecting you? Are you feeling any fear? Is it holding you back, or is it actually making you do more? So these are just some examples, but think about that in your own context. What might you be fearful of? And these are some common responses to fear. So typically, when we're in a situation of fear, we're more likely to avoid behavior or avoid actions. So to take on a flight or a freeze response. So not the green one, but the red and the blue ones. In a fearful situation, individuals are likely to either want to escape a situation. These are, by the way, some famous movie scenes, which I hope you recognize. So you might either want to run, Forrest, run, and escape a situation that you're fearful of, and in which case you might not be enacting what you know you need to be doing, or you might freeze in the face of threat or danger or fear and be paralyzed and do nothing. And we found that a lot of businesses actually are in freeze mode. They're not necessarily fighting fear, not necessarily escaping, but just in a state of pausing and just not knowing how to proceed because of uncertainty and change that is surrounding us. But then if we are able to face fear with courage and fight it, that's when we can really get things moving and act upon our knowledge and close the gap between knowing and doing. So to relate these two together, the knowing, doing gap and fear, this was basically an idea that I came up with as it was the fruit of my labor for my PhD research, basically, is where I linked fear and the knowing, doing gap. If you are in a situation of fear that leads to freezing or fleeing a situation, so not necessarily enacting what you know you need to do, that's basically avoidance behavior that leads to widening the gap. So if I'm escaping situations, not addressing them, resisting them, then my knowing isn't necessarily translated into doing. But if I'm able to face my fear, either by regulating the emotion of fear or maybe cognitively coping or just being courageous or using fear as a motivator towards action, then I'm likely to approach behavior which might close or bridge the gap. Very simple idea there, but I hope that it gives you some food for thought and just to think about how the fear that we're all experiencing in the current situation might impact how much we are doing and how maybe little we are doing, if we're really honest. So before we move on to strategies about facing fear, I hope there are no questions. Feel free to drop in any questions you might have. And Louise, you can feel free to interrupt me.
There are some questions, Amal, but I think what we should do is wrap your session up and then let's get into conversation with each other.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there are three mindset shifts that I wanted to talk about when thinking about fear and how we can face fear. So fear is always going to be there. How can we shift our mindset, shift our perspective to be able to overcome it? So I'm giving you three strategies which may or may not apply to you, but let's think about the first mindset shift. Sorry. The first is to embrace inevitable uncertainties. In the situation that we're in now, we're not going to be able to eliminate the uncertainty. So we need to just embrace that the situation is always going to be uncertain and try to identify the source of our fear before trying to tackle it. So why are we fearful? What is the uncertainty that is making us feel the fear? If we're able to get to the root of that fear, then we're able to tackle it. So to give you an example, if you are in a situation where you're coming up with a new vision for your SME, your professional or your personal life, you have this new vision and you're really afraid that your vision will fail. Now, is it fear of failure that is really standing in your way? Are you afraid of failing, or are you worried about the consequences of failing? Maybe not getting others on board with your vision, maybe humiliation if you fail. So if you could tackle these other sources deeply rooted within the fear of failure, of your vision, then you're maybe able to tackle it even more. If we look at, for example, a new change that is freaking you out, are you actually afraid of the change? Or maybe you haven't explored it fully from every angle. Maybe it's too risky because you haven't really analyzed this new project, this new change that you're trying to get to. So just try and think about one level deeper of what the fear is. And maybe if you really tackle the root, then you could really get to overcoming the fear. It's just an encouragement for you to reflect deeply on any fear that you're experiencing at the moment. So the first mindset shift is to accept uncertainties. The second one is to accept possible failures as well. So mistakes can be learning points over time. Now, this might be easier said than done. Some mistakes are really going to cost you an entire business. It might even cost people their lives, whereas other mistakes are more manageable. So I'm really talking about mistakes that you can manage, mistakes that you can take. And this also, attitudes towards failure and making mistakes varies across cultures and individuals. So some leaders would feel a real reputational damage if they have a failure or make a mistake, whereas others just take it as a learning experience and move forward. This is an example of US entrepreneurs, for example. If you look at Henry Ford and Steve Jobs, even Donald Trump, if we look at those examples, entrepreneurship in the US is looked upon as the $1 million MBA. So it's a journey that's full of mistakes and failures, but also key lessons that allow the entrepreneur to pick themselves up and bounce back and do better. And so that's how they view the failure in entrepreneurship, whereas in other cultures, it might not be the case. So what does failure mean to you? Another reflection, another question that I'm throwing out there for you to think about. What is it like to fear failure? Some examples here from people we all know about. For example, in the UK, if you look at Richard Branson, that Virgin Empire of his has many, many different segments. And so we don't really remember the ones that haven't done so well. So we forget about Virgin Cosmetics or Virgin Cola that are not as successful as Virgin Media and Virgin Finance. So the attitude towards failure here in the UK is you can pick yourself up and learn from the mistake. Now, does that really apply to you? Is that something we can maybe change our perspective on failure and think about it in a different way? And lastly, mindset shift number 3 is viewing fear as an ally, actually, and not as an enemy. So how can we use fear as a positive energy towards success, towards bold action, towards acting upon our knowledge? So that's an interesting book there for you. Feel the fear and do it anyway. Some of you might have read it. It's a very famous, well-known book. But it's just basically built upon this idea that fear can be good. It's not always going to be there, but it's also not going to go away. Just try to embrace it. The fact that you feel fearful is actually meaning that you're trying to achieve something great. You're trying to challenge the status quo. You're trying to change, to reboot, to do something better, hopefully. And fear can really help us to avoid complacency and to just do the same thing on and on. And I think that with COVID, for example, it's pushed the boundaries. It got people to do things differently, and it got us all moving much faster than we would have. Like, we always knew that we wanted to do free webinars, for example, but it really got us doing it. The urgency of that, maybe not fear, but the situation just created that urgency to do better, to do more, to get innovative. So how can it really help you? How can you turn the negative into opportunities? Another inspiring example for you, which you all are very familiar with, I'm sure. So basically, courage is not really being fearless, but it's facing fear. So it's courage despite fear. So the last bit of my talk was about productivity in the new normal. And I wanted to really pause and take some questions, but I realized we are running out of time. So I will move on to productivity, being that many of you have already commented on this in the Q&A, and this is something that it really resonates. So how has productivity changed in the new normal? Look at these 3 pictures, and people basically are now operating in the new normal, and it's hit us in different ways. So there are some people who are staying home and have plenty more time to think about and reflect and try and consider all angles of how we can improve our businesses, ourselves, professionally, personally. There are others who are trying to juggle different roles. They're trying to be parents, they're trying to be leaders, they are trying to be colleagues. And so the situation has hit people in different ways, and it's always important for us to remember that when we're talking to other people in our meetings, that we are impacted by this in different ways. We all share that common fear, the common uncertainty, but the impact of it is not necessarily always the same. And working virtually has had its pros and cons. So it's pushed us to innovate and to do things differently in good ways, but it's also had many disadvantages for people. So we are, and they call this social distancing, but we are really physically distant, but we're very much socially connected. So I'm connected to all of you today, and I wouldn't have even dreamed of this 2 months ago, well, 3 months ago. I wouldn't have thought that I would be doing this webinar today and getting to know all of you beautiful people. So it's really, it's got people connected in different ways. Also think about how much connection you have formed with your own colleagues, with your own people that you work with your own family and friends that you might be connected with generally, but are even more connected with now in the current circumstance. But I wanted to touch upon productivity in the sense of how this new situation has really blurred our work-life balance. So for those people in the pictures here that are juggling different roles at the same time, work-life balance has gone out the window the way that we know it. So it's no longer about doing work hours and then going home and doing dinner and so on. It's kind of blurred now. You might be in a meeting and feeding a child at the same time. And so how do you make that work for you? How do we operate business as usual in the lockdown? What new digital skills might we need to learn? What might we need to unlearn? So if this situation has challenged work-life balance and has challenged the way we do things, the way we know things, what do we need to unlearn so that we can move forward? So all these questions that I'm throwing out there for you to think about. And how can we increase and sustain our productivity? So I have 3 tips that I wanted to share with you really quickly. The first on increasing and sustaining productivity is to think about potential stressors that you have on your work-life balance at the moment and try to plan around those. So if you plan a daily schedule for you and anyone at home that works with you, that could really help. So if you think, and I do that at home in my own life. So my husband and I plan when we're doing our meetings, when we're doing our things, so that we make sure that one of us is with our child at any moment in time. So he's currently babysitting while I'm doing this. And we have a daily schedule. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes we have to be at meetings, at webinars at the same time. But as long as you try and plan and have some sort of a rule, then that could help. You might want to also establish rules to help others understand when you are available or not. And that's helpful if you have a bit older kids. So kids who would understand the rules, maybe set your own boundaries. So we're doing these social distancing, keeping 2 meters apart from people, but how do we do the distancing at home when our work-life balance has really blurred and things have merged? Maybe you could have like a closed or open door policy. If my door is open, you can come in and talk to me. If it's shut, I'm in a really important meeting. Or think about ways that work for you. Another thing that's really important is to check in virtually with colleagues as well. So yes, we're doing more meetings online and things, but let's try and connect with them virtually beyond work as well. And most importantly, to log off remote working as you would typically do when you leave the office. So a lot of what I notice with a lot of people that I know is that they're working longer hours now because they're unable to switch off. The laptop is always there, your phone is always there, you're available all the time, but maybe set timings for yourself to manage that blur. If you're spending more time maybe making lunch, taking breaks during the day, try and make up for that later on, but make it work for you. Set your own schedule and your own boundaries and time limits. So the second tip is to prioritize your tasks. Working on several tasks can really hinder mental concentration. We're trying to multitask here. We're trying to be parents, colleagues, leaders at the same time. And so if we try and single task rather than multitask, we might be able to be more productive. One way you can also prioritize your tasks is looking at this Eisenhower matrix. Look at how urgent and how important your tasks are. So if you have a list of actions at the moment, think about which ones are most urgent and most important. These are the ones you need to do first. Those that are really important but not urgent can be done later. So you can't procrastinate there and have a knowing gap, and that is fine because they're not necessarily urgent. those tasks that are urgent but not really important maybe can be delegated. And also think about which ones you might want to eliminate. Just because you used to do something in the old normal doesn't mean you have to carry on doing it now. So try to reevaluate and think about what's working for you now and what isn't, and move ahead. And then lastly, another tip for you is to use the Pomodoro technique. And that's breaking up big tasks into smaller actions. So that's really important with the knowing doing gap. For the person who asked me earlier about long-term versus short-term actions, and I said focus on the short-term, break down big complex long-term plans into smaller tasks. The smaller a task, the more simple a task is, the less likely we are to procrastinate. So if you have a big task at hand, try to break it up. And if you want to use the Pomodoro technique, it's just basically a technique to say that try to identify one task and set a timer to get the task done. The suggestion with the Pomodoro technique is slicing the tomato to 25-minute slots. So you do a task for 25 minutes, you take a break, and then you come back for another 25 minutes, you take a break. You might want to use the 25 minutes, but you might want to alter it to whatever works for you. Just break up your tasks, break up your daily routine into smaller, easy steps. Celebrate the small wins so that you can get motivated to do more. That can really help to increase your productivity. If we try to get the big picture done and we just look at it at the start of the day and it's a really big task that we need to achieve, we're more likely to procrastinate, be slow, be more fearful, or not really close the gap unless we can see it as a really small achievable task. And lastly, don't forget self-care. And some of you did note that in your knowing doing gap exercise with eating better, sleeping better. Remember self-care. When our work-life balance is so blurred, we might tend to forget about taking care of our meals, taking care of relaxation, refreshing, recharging, exercising. I try and do my daily yoga, but it doesn't always work. So try and find a rhythm that works for you, an exercise that works for you, and keep at it, because that will help you stay energized and more productive. So I whizzed through that really quickly. I'm sorry about that, but it was more important for me to take time for you to do your own reflections than for me to throw more content on you. So basically, in terms of today's summary, we looked at reflecting on the knowing doing gap. We looked at mindset shifts when it comes to facing our fears. And then we looked at some tips to increase and sustain productivity. Before I take any questions at the end, I want to leave you with this takeaway. If you forget everything we did today, please think about 3 key messages from your own reflections today, or what you have learned from today's session. But more importantly, think about the doing. So what are you going things in your own context? So knowing about the knowing doing gap is not enough. The session today was aimed at getting you to know about the knowing doing gap. But what are you going to do with that knowing now is what really matters. So please take the time to do this exercise in your own time. What are 3 key learnings and what are you going to do about them in your own context right now? So that's all I had for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amal. I think we'll go back to that before you take your presentation down. Won't you go back to that previous slide just for a moment?
Sure.
Because I would like to encourage everybody to take this back to your teams, to your families, to whoever makes sense to you in your world right now. And perhaps this is a place where you can carve out some thinking space for you and the people that matter right now. I love that. Reflection, takeaway.
Yes, it's not reflection, but it's all about the action.
It's all about the action. And that is so important right now because, and I think it's because of that earlier point, that productivity right now doesn't necessarily look the same as it does in business as normal, right?
No.
So such an important point.
We have to unlearn and think about what works for us. But also, really importantly, what you just said about sharing it with someone else, as soon as you share it and say it out loud, it adds that accountability. So if you are going to do A, B, and C, tell your partner, your colleague that you are planning to do that, because then they could hold you accountable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Amal, please can I ask you to stop share your presentation on that side? Let's take a few comments. Let's take a few questions. Thank you very, very much. Brad Watson wants to know, do you include paranoia and anxiety in your fear categorization, or how do you stand in respect to those two emotions?
They can be, but in my research and the slides that I've shown you, I was looking at fear in a particular context, in a particular situation. So what we call a fear state. So it's a state that comes and goes rather than a trait that you carry with you. Something like paranoia is something that is more stable, that is there regardless of the situation. At least that's how I see it. Whereas the fears that I'm talking about are really contextual, something that comes and goes. Just because you're experiencing fear in a situation doesn't make you paranoid all the time or a fearful person, but it's just how you interpret a situation in a particular point in time.
Exactly like that. And it's likely that at times like these, those emotions, that fearful response would be elevated.
Yeah.
Patrick Royal says, excellent, thanks, hit the spot. Amanda Wild, all the way from London, closer to where you are than where we are, says, as we say in London, mind the gap. And
Exactly.
This is
I actually had that in one of the slides.
Now we do something about it. There we go. Thank you so much. Lots of appreciation for your session today. Let me find us a question that we can talk about. Myrna Braun says, great tips on healthy boundaries. I think which is truly helpful in a time like this. And then also, of course, being able to manage our attention. And that Pomodoro technique of yours, I think, really, really helpful in that sense. Lee says, we're born with just two fears, the fear of loud sounds and the fear of falling. The rest are learned. Isn't that an interesting point?
Indeed.
P Pacific. Now, P Pacific, I actually met on a program that I was on 10 years ago. So it's so amazing, P, to see you pop up here. Now, he says, COVID-19 in many ways has been traumatic for many, and this is true. Yet, these exercises require a decent level of presence. Some may not even know the effect of trauma and that their reasoning is affected. Any suggestions on what we can do first to be fully present and rational and ready for this?
Yes. Take the time to do that. I think we need to set time aside where you're not doing anything. Remember what I said about multitasking? We're currently and constantly multitasking, trying to do so many things at once, and our minds are always going all the time. So it's carving time out for yourself. I would like to say meditate and do yoga, but I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. It works for me. Just to carve time to sit down in silence and think about your current situation and make time for reflection. So if you are using the Pomodoro technique, one of those breaks that you do can just be simply sitting in silence for 5 minutes and doing nothing, because that's when you really can see these things.
Absolutely. And sometimes journaling, writing it out, right?
Yes.
Getting out of the chaos and onto a paper in front of you.
Talking through with other people as well.
Yeah, have conversations. Thank you. I think those are some of the key questions that we had today for us to talk through. I'm having a quick roll through, and then anything else that we have, we can absolutely pick up with you again, Amal.
Sure.
Amal, all the way here in South Africa, possibly Brazil, we know back in London, we've had people here from Botswana, from Zimbabwe, from Nigeria, you from Bahrain.
That's fantastic.
UK, it's extraordinary.
Physically distant, but socially connected.
Exactly like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
To our community out there, this has been, and this series is in 4 parts. We started off with 3 sessions on Stabilize. We then moved into 3 sessions on Assess. How do we assess our options? What are the options available to you? We looked at how, as a non-techie, you can look at building a digital business. What are your options from a sales point of view? What are your options from a marketing point of view? The considerations of Marlborough today is, as we start to pivot, how do we do that in a way that is productive? And what are some of the tools that we allow ourselves to apply that maintain our productivity, and not just ours? These are such beautiful tools to bring into the spaces where we have to take other people with us as we start to pivot, right? Tomorrow, we are fortunate to have Andrew Godley, Professor Andrew Godley back with us, and he is going to talk about how we design trust into brands, but also considering alliances, and specifically with bigger businesses, if you're looking at it from the perspective of a small business. Now, guys, once we've done with the pivot part, we're going to start to talk about the grow part. That will be our last 3 sessions for the 12 sessions as they stand at the moment, but watch the space, more might be happening. from a grow point of view, we're going to look at growth hacking your digital business. And we have our very own Alan Reyes from Race Corp with us to talk about that. And then we're going to have Dr. Adeyinka Adewale from Nigeria by way of the UK that will talk about digital businesses on African soil to give us some examples of what incredible businesses are doing on African soil in South Africa, but beyond South Africa, very much so as well, because I think some of the most innovative examples of digital businesses can be found on our own soil. So Amal, I thank you. It is time for us to play out today. And today, because today is about women, we're going to play out, let me bring it up. Just one second. There we go. And share. We're keeping it at home, but some incredible local women, and not just local, from the UK as well, specifically Erin Allen Kane, but we have Amy Faku, Bonga Kwanu, Misaki, and Zolani. Tounga Zilibali means don't forget yourself. The song is an ode to women's strength and their unlimited power, but this is not just for women. This is for all of you, because you are powerful beyond your own imagination. And that is to paraphrase Madiba. And I've seen some extraordinary people on this forum over the last 7-8 days, and I look forward to spending the next 4 with you. You're amazing, playing you out.